Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So let me introduce our next speaker. It's Andrew Saxe. He's a Schwartz postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Brain Science at the Harvard University. He did his PhD at Stanford, where he was advised by J. McClelland and Andrew Ng, and where he held Stanford graduate and NDSCG fellowships. His research focuses on the theory of deep learning and its applications to phenomena in neuroscience and psychology. And today he will speak about hallmarks of deep learning in the brain. So, Andrew.
Thanks. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Okay, so it's a remarkable fact that pretty much all you have to do to get better at something is continue to do it, right? And whatever it might be, tennis, learning math, if you do it, you get better at it most of the time. And this is a key challenge for theory. I'm sure it drives many of us in this room, is to understand how human-level learning arises from changes in synaptic strengths, and linking this to behavior is a key challenge. And I think actually a key difficulty is the brain's depth. And by that I mean layered anatomical structure. And computationally, we know that depth makes learning difficult. So anatomically, in the object recognition pathway, for example, you have inputs that come in from the eye, that go to the retina through the LGN, and then up through V1, V2, V4, and IT. So you have this succession of stages in the anatomy, maybe order 5 of them. And of course, if you were to zoom in within any one of these regions, you'd also see that there are interlaminar structure within that layer. And so you can have another 2 to 3 layers within each area, perhaps. So overall, you're talking order 10 layers in this object recognition pathway. There's also evidence for depth just from the physiology. If you record, we've heard about this several times at this point, if you record from different layers of the visual hierarchy, you see simple responses in the beginning layers, and you see complex responses in the final layers, and that's suggestive of this sort of staged computation. And computationally, it won't surprise people here to know that deep learning is difficult. So here I'm showing artificial 5-layer network trained on a handwritten digit task, and you can see it sort of stays not learning very well at all at the beginning before it sort of non-linearly bumps down to 0 error eventually. So what I'd like to suggest in the talk is, to the extent that you agree that the brain is a layered structure, to the extent that you think that deep learning is hard, then you should be wondering how depth impacts learning in the brain, okay? And what I'm going to try to do here is identify hallmarks of deep learning. So this should be an empirical question, right? Does depth impact learning in the brain? To know that, we need to understand how depth changes learning dynamics. What could you measure that would convince you that depth is an irrelevant factor here? So really we need a theory of deep learning that explains the impact of depth on learning dynamics. So the bulk of this talk is going to be an attempt to give such a theory for a simplified model class. And then that will be sort of general points, so I'll specialize it and show that you can specialize it to specific experimental paradigms to get very specific predictions for individual experiments. Okay. So what do we want from a theory? Well, we want to know things like how depth impacts learning dynamics, learning speed, and learned representations, for instance. And the strategy I'm going to take is to use a very simple model class. And I think particularly for the brain sciences, this is crucial. You need a simple model class that you can get unambiguous predictions from, one that will isolate the contribution of depth so that you know that if I find something, it was only due to depth and nothing else. So here's what I'm going to do. Well, here's the deep network. It takes its input in on the right over there, and it passes through nonlinear layers. And of course, it's nonlinearities to make it hard, so I'm going to do something drastic and just take out all the nonlinearities. Okay, so we're going to look at a deep linear neural network. So what is this thing? Well, it just produces its output by multiplying a bunch of weight matrices times its input. And you could, of course, always rewrite that as just a single linear matrix W total. So here, this model class is completely controlling for representational power. You add layers, you're getting nothing in additional computational power. So it's just isolating the impact of depth itself, which is this layered factorization into matrices. So you're probably thinking, okay, but I don't really care how learning happens in that because surely that's trivial, right? But I'd like to convince you otherwise. So these plots that I showed you are actually from deep linear networks. So you can see they have these plateaus and sudden transitions, nonlinear learning trajectories. They also show interesting behavior like faster convergence from pre-trained initial conditions. And so the hope is that if we can understand exactly where this comes from in the linear case, it will give us better intuitions for the nonlinear case. Okay, so why aren't they trivial? Well, it's a question of it's a question of what is linear. It's the input-output map that is linear, all right? But the error function is nonlinear. So when you're doing learning, you're plugging this linear input-output map into a nonlinear error function, and the minimization problem that you're trying to solve is non-convex, actually, provided that you have a deep network. And so the gradient descent dynamics that arise from this are nonlinear and coupled. And if you look at that equation, you'll see there's cubic interactions in the weights. And another interesting property of these gradient descent equations is that the only way that the training data enters is through the input correlations and the input-output correlations. So our central goal here is to solve these equations, to reveal the full dynamic trajectory of learning as a function of the input and input-output correlations and for different depths. So deep linear networks are not new. There was has been a lot of work on them. So for instance, the critical points were worked out by Baldi and Hornick in 1989. Shallow dynamics have been studied. Three-layer dynamics have been studied. These are all fascinating papers, and I suggest you have a look. But the dynamics analyses don't generalize to deeper networks. So we need a new approach that will take us to deeper networks. And the way that we're going to do this is via an SVD change of variables. Okay, so essentially what we have here, the world on the top is giving us this input-output correlation matrix that specifies the data set. We're going to decompose that into a product of three matrices where the SVD is breaking it down into a series of modes. Each mode contains three things. It contains an input singular vector, which is determining which inputs are participating in this mode. And it links that to an output singular vector, which is determining which features are mapped on the output side. And then the strength of that interconnection is the singular value, which is on the diagonal along that matrix. So when we do this SVD change of variables, essentially we're analyzing the network's learning dynamics in this reference frame. And so what's going to be changing is effective singular values denoted by A here. And so we're going to be tracking how that changes over time. So just to put it in equations, the network is doing a time-dependent SVD, and what we're going to be looking at is the coefficients of that time-dependent SVD. Okay, so what's the intuition behind what's going on here? Well, essentially we're pulling out these hidden 1D neural networks. Okay, so they're all mixed together in the standard deep network, but we have just the right change of variables and initial conditions to pull apart this into a set of completely independent 1D networks. And by 1D network, I mean there's just one neuron at each layer. Okay, so if we look at this, look at one of these 1D networks, what does it look like? Well, it's taking the projection of one of these singular vectors onto its input, and it's multiplying it by a bunch of scalars. So the B's are now scalars, indicating the layer strength in each of those 1D chains, and then you're projecting it onto the output. And if you multiply all those B's together, that brings you to the overall effective singular value strength. So again, just to show what learning looks like in this setting, let me play this video. And you'll see that the singular values pop up over time in the network, and it successively refines the network's input-output map until it's fully learned the input-output correlations. Okay, so now that we have this concept of mode, we can look in more detail about how a deep network learns. Let's start with the error surface. So the error surface is given by this for one mode, and of course you can be summing across all the modes, but we can just look at just one of them. And if I additionally assume that your layer strengths are roughly equal to start, then I can just plot for you the error surface of these networks as I increase the depth. And here they are. So some things to note, if you look at the shallow network, it's just this nice parabola. It's convex. It only has one global minimum. But then as you increase the depth, you see this shift where now it's non-convex. Okay. And as far as the fixed points go, again, this is known. I'm just translating it into these, this formalism. The fixed points are scaling back as you increase the depth. Those are the global minima. But then there's also this interesting saddle point up here, which corresponds to all of the layer strengths being 0. And there's a plateau next to the saddle point. And that's only present for deeper networks. So as long as you have one hidden layer or more. And this is the structure of the error surface. So now if we're moving to the dynamics, I'm going to plot here the gradient descent dynamics. So just imagine dropping balls on the surface that are going to roll down, but they have no momentum. And on this axis, on the lower plot, I'm going to plot the effective overall singular value strength. And what you'll see is that as they come in, it's the shallower networks that learn more quickly than the deeper networks, and the deeper networks are stuck on that plateau. And eventually, they expel. So already we have one fundamental distinction between shallow and deep learning. Shallow learning shows roughly exponential approach behavior on each of these modes, whereas deep learning shows fundamentally sigmoidal behavior. It can look like nothing is happening for quite a while, and then all of a sudden you get a roughly stage-like transition to fully learning the mode. And in red here, so I have been introducing some small technical approximations. In red, I'm showing simulations of full networks from random weights, just to show you that these analytic descriptions do accurately represent that case. Okay, so that's great. Can we actually get the analytic form of that curve? The answer is yes. So here's the differential equation describing how these effective singular values evolve. You notice that depth is one of the key terms there. So for different depths, we get different differential equations describing how the effective singular value changes. I just want to pull out 3 special cases. In the shallow network, as I said, you have exponential approach. In a minimally deep network, you already have a sigmoidal shape. And in a very deep network, the limit as depth goes to infinity. Now you have this form that involves the Lambert W function. And just to show you what those look like, there they are. So you can see the switch from exponential approach to a sigmoid. Okay, so once you have an analytic trajectory that describes the entire time course of learning, you basically ask whichever question you like about the network and come up with a crisp answer. So for example, how long does it take to learn a mode? Well, each mode is learned in time 1 over s, where s is the size of the singular value. So it's a very simple idea that the stronger a correlation exists in the environment, the faster you learn it. But we can also ask much more central questions. For example, how does deep learning speed scale with depth? This is a critical question. If I train a 3-layer network, and then I train a 100-layer network on the same task, how much slower is that 100-layer network? Okay, so to get at this, we also need to understand the optimal learning rate scaling with depth, because you can't just keep it fixed. So you can do that by looking at the Hessian, and so it turns out it scales as 1 over the depth. Okay, so when you put that into the equations, what you get is this, this result for the time difference. The time it takes to learn a very, very deep network compared to the time it takes to learn a shallow network is order 1 over the initial mode strength raised to the depth of the network. So this is a fundamental prediction, actually, of the theory, and it's quite remarkable because what it's saying is deep learning does not need to be slow necessarily. It depends critically on your initial condition. It will be exponentially slow if your initial layer strength is small, but it will only be a constant factor slower if the layer strength is not small. And the intuition here, if you look at the point above 1, you can see that all the curves are swirling around that point at 1. Essentially, if you have an initial layer strength that starts at 1, you're always beyond the edge of the plateau. So descent will be easy. Whereas if you have anything to the left, like 0.5, you can see that as you increase the depth, you're getting more and more stuck on the plateau. And mathematically, the intuition is that the gradient norm is actually growing with depth, but the learning rate is decaying. You multiply the 2 and it's constant speed. Okay, so this is a prediction, but we have to go test it. So we looked at deep linear networks learning the MNIST classification task. And here's the scaling of learning time with depth, and you can see that the deep networks are slower, but it's saturating. It's not exponentially slower. It actually appears to be only a finite amount slower. So this is giving us some traction on what initializations do, right? If you initialize with small random weights, then you're initializing with a layer strength that's small, and so the training speed is going to be very slow. It's going to scale exponentially with depth. However, if you use a strategy like unsupervised pre-training, say with autoencoders, that corresponds to learning orthogonal matrices in this case, and the initial layer strengths would be approximately 1, and so training speed is now only a constant time. And there I'm talking about just the fine-tuning time, so you also have to deal with the pre-training time. Okay, so far this has just been an attempt to understand learning dynamics in a deep network, but often when you try to understand something, you end up figuring out how to control it and possibly coming up with an engineering contribution as well. And so from this we thought, well, why do the pre-training? Why not just initialize straight to the orthogonal initialization? The theory predicts that that should have depth-independent training times. So don't bother with pre-training, just jump straight to an orthogonal matrix as your initialization. And if you do that, indeed you do see these depth-independent training times. This is again for deep linear networks, where the red curve there shows that these orthogonal initializations, it doesn't matter how deep it is, they're always very fast. Okay, so to summarize the theory's predictions about the effect of initializations, small random weights will scale exponentially with depth. It's very bad. Pre-training and fine-tuning scales linearly because you have to pre-train D networks. But orthogonal initialization is potentially depth independent. All right, but to really cash this out in an engineering context, you need to be able to extend it to nonlinear networks. And the right thing to do is to add in a scale factor. So it's a scaled orthogonal initialization where the gain is going to counteract the effect of nonlinearity. And we have a way of doing a prediction for that nonlinearity. So essentially you tell me the activation function and you just turn the crank and it tells you the right gain to use. And so now we can train potentially much deeper networks in a quite quick fashion. So here's, for instance, TANH networks trained on the this is the left. You can see the red curve there is the scaled orthogonal initializations, and it hits zero training error around epoch 200. And on the right is a depth 100 network. It's quite deep, but it still is hitting zero training error on that same epoch 200. And this is just showing that indeed these orthogonal initializations have approximately depth-independent training times, and it's better than using Gaussian random initializations. And finally, the prediction, our theoretical prediction for the optimal G, as you increase the depth of network, the empirically derived optimal G is indeed converging to our theoretical prediction. All right, so that's about learning dynamics. The last thing we can look at is deep representations. How are inputs transformed across a deep network? And this has been widely studied in nonlinear nets, and the nonlinear case is admittedly much more interesting in this context, but we still say something about it. So here's an example of how it's been studied. You show an image to both an artificial network and a brain, and you record from the brain, you record activities in the artificial neural network, and then you make a comparison between these two. It's very interesting work. But what happens in a deep linear neural network? Well, here's the intuition. If you have an input that has high variance, it's a high variance input direction, but it shouldn't link up to the output, so it's not relevant to your task at hand, then in the hidden layers of that neural network, the presence of that input is going to exponentially decay away in the hidden representations. Conversely, if you have a small variation in the input that you need to boost to get to the output, then it's going to exponentially increase across the depth of the network. So this is a single network looking at how the representations change across layers. So that's for one mode. And of course, the actual network is going to be a mixture of that. So you have a mixture of modes, and some are amplifying, some are decaying. And so over the course of this deep network, you can look at the changing correlation structure of its hidden representations, and it's going to shift from a more perceptual set of correlations to a more task-based set of correlations by the end of learning. Okay, so you get this progression. And here's just quantifying that. At the beginning, you're very close to correlation matrix that's just the perceptual correlations, and by the end you're very close to the correlation matrix that's just governed by the task correlations. And this is consistent, at least broadly consistent, with recent experimental results. So this is showing the black bars here are sort of a perceptual Gabor model, showing how much variance that explains in the across the cortical depth, whereas the white bars here are a higher conceptual distinction between animate and inanimate items. You can see that it's sort of exponentially increasing across depth. Okay, so some hallmarks of depth that we've identified. Well, it seems like, at least in the deep linear case, saddle points are the trouble that can slow down learning. And because of those, you get these sigmoidal irregular learning trajectories. And we've seen that there's a very strong effect of initial knowledge. Depends very sensitively on exactly how this network has been set up. And as far as the internal structure goes, if you look across hidden representations, you can see a transformation from more perceptual representation to a more task-oriented representation. And just one caveat while I'm discussing this is that we're only analyzing training error. So there's probably a lot more to be said about generalization error. So that's just where we are now. So I just want to mention that I haven't been talking about generalization error anywhere. Okay, so this is a deep linear network. You should ask if it's even remotely similar to what you see in nonlinear networks. I'm not going to talk much about this, but just note that there is recent theoretical work suggesting that the conceptual picture I've just painted for you actually does transfer quite well to the nonlinear networks. But everything I've been talking about is quite a coarse prediction, right? Sigmoidal learning curves. It's not something that you could really go and test with experiments. But the theory, I think, provides the tools, which now you can go specialize to a specific experiment. And I'm going to take perceptual learning as an example. Okay. Perceptual learning is just the observation that if you practice a task, for example, this visual discrimination task, you get better over time. All right, so in a standard experiment, you have a monkey focus at a fixation point, and then you show it this sort of rotated Gabor filter in its visual field, and you just ask it, was that clockwise or counterclockwise? It's about the simplest thing you could extract, but as the monkey practices this, it gets better and better and better. It can actually get very, very good. So it's very fine, small orientation differences that it's detecting. And this has been very heavily studied empirically, and the broad conclusion from many papers is that you see larger changes in higher areas, like V4 and IT, as compared to lower areas, like V1. And many people have found this surprising because if you think V1 is orientation selective, and the most orientation selective of those areas, this is a fine orientation discrimination task. So many people had thought, well, this should really be what's the V1 would be the site of the most plasticity. It does not seem to be the case. So still a relevant question today is what determines the distribution of changes across this cortical hierarchy? All right, how will we build a deep network theory of this? Well, I'm just going to instantiate three basic assumptions. The first is deep chain-like structure. The second is stronger orientation tuning in lower layers. That's an assumption about the initialization, right, which we've seen can be very important. And then the third is gradient descent learning. And so a minimal model will look something like this. We have an input, which is one of the two angles that you're being presented. That's processed by a layer of orientation-tuned neurons in the input layer. And then we have a decision layer, which I'm going to initially start off at 0. So it's completely untuned. So this is sort of an extreme version of we have an orientation-tuned input layer, and we have absolutely no tuning in the higher layer. And just to note that these bell curve tuning curves, they're not Gaussians, they're not parametrized. You can put in whatever you like there, and the model will give you predictions. And when gradient descent is acting, it can change any point on this curve, so it's not parametrized. And yet, even though we have all this flexibility in the model, the simplicity of the task means that we can still get an exact reduction. Okay, so we can take the full gradient descent dynamics, but reduce them to just two scalar variables. Here's how it works. Your input matrix is going to be its original bell curve tuning, but now plus a term which is basically that red squiggle. It's the difference between the two population responses. And that's going to be scaled up over time by this alpha scalar. And the weights in the second layer are also scaling up as beta. So it just happens to be the case that this reduction works. You plug it into the equations and check. And so we end up with these reduced dynamics. So again, these scalar equations are describing the trajectory of every single weight in that entire original network. So now that we have these, we can ask what changes within a layer and how do changes compare across layers. And that's really what this theory is buying us. Okay, so within a layer, the prediction is that the most informative neurons change most. This has been looked at in detail experimentally. So what I'm showing there is data from monkeys where they found that the neurons with the highest slope, which means they're most informative, increased their slope a little bit more when they were trained. So it's the most informative neurons are changing most, and that's the prediction in this deep linear network. It's also the prediction of many previous shallow models. But now we can look across layers. And here, something interesting happens. It's actually the exact flip. It's the weakest layer that changes the most now. So in green, we have the decision layer, and you can see that it changes more, and it also changes earlier than the input layer. All right, so that's a two-layer case, but you might ask, does this generalize in deeper networks? And the answer is basically yes. So now we have these layer-wise mode strengths. And if they're ordered in some way, so one is bigger than another is bigger than another, if you reverse that order, that is the order of the sizes of the changes. Okay, so there's this fundamental idea that it's the weakest layer that's changing the most. And so to the extent that you think higher layers are less orientation tuned in this context, you should think that they're going to be changing more, not less. And the intuition here is just that deep network behaves like a chain. If at any link of that chain you drop away the signal, it's gone and it can't come back. So you have to change the weakest link. And experimentally, there's lots of evidence for this reverse hierarchy of improvements, but I'm just going to show one example. So here you're looking at what you should be looking at is the increase in slopes. This is before and after training. And so the increase in slopes in these lower two lines is in V4, where there's a 28% improvement, whereas in V1, there's only a 7% improvement. So essentially, we have these two fundamental topologies, parallel structure and serial structure. In parallel structure, you have the most informative neuron changing the most, but in serial or deep structure, it's behaving like a chain, and it's actually the weakest layer that needs to change the most. Okay, and finally, a key focus in experimental work is spatial transfer. So suppose I train you at one position, but then test you at another position. They found beautiful patterns for how you will transfer to these different locations. So what I'm going to do is take that minimal model, but now replicate it at m different locations, and then I'm going to add in some spatial pooling. So now I have a V4 that has some fixed spatial pooling according to some bell curve tuning. And I've structured it in a way so that the dynamics are no different, but now we can ask how well you will transfer to different locations. So here's an example. The blue curve is showing your performance improvement at a trained location. The green curve is showing your performance improvement some distance away. And the general intuition is you're going to completely lose whatever's at the lower layer when you transfer, and you're going to transfer some of what's at the higher layer. Okay. So this theory now gives a rich set of predictions about how these things interact. So for instance, remember I told you earlier that the decision layer changes earlier than the input layer. So this immediately suggests that early learning should transfer better than late learning, because it's only when the input layer changes that you're going to lose that. And this has recently been confirmed experimentally. And it also makes a prediction for task precision. So if you're doing a very high precision task, then you're going to follow these curves out all the way maybe to that red line there. So the input layer has changed a lot, so you're not going to transfer very well. Whereas if you're doing a low precision task, you essentially get to stop quite early, where most of the change occurred in the decision layer. And this has also been shown in a number of experiments. Okay, and as always, all these predictions are from a completely linear neural network. So we need to go verify that you can actually get it to work in the nonlinear network. And so we have done that with a sort of more typical deep architecture, and qualitatively all these findings replicate. So what I hope I've convinced you of is the value of minimal models. So in much the same way that in control theory we studied linear control theory, in electrical engineering we study linear circuits, that sheds light on the more complex phenomena, and hopefully we can use these simplified models to shed light on the more complex nonlinear networks. And I think the key thing is, what do you get from linear control theory? No actual system is linear, right? So what do you get from it? And I think what you get is conceptual structure, right? The right conceptual understanding clarifies things like stability. That's a key idea. Controllability, reachability, things like that. And we want those similar kinds of concepts that we can import into our understanding of learning systems. Okay, so to conclude, it's been observed that learning in a deep chain-like structure is hard, and my suggestion is that overcoming this challenge may be a key factor shaping learning in the brain and mind. And I presented a theory that yields sort of rich predictions about the effective depth on learning dynamics, but still remains tractable. And I've seen one example sort of goes with the theme of this symposium, where just the desire to understand these systems did ultimately lead to an engineering advance with the orthogonal initializations that permit fast training of even very deep networks. But I'm most excited by these models for their ability to connect computation, neural structures, and behavior. So we have all these ingredients. We have their learning. They have a neural link, and they're giving us interesting behaviors. And we can now start to understand this in a variety of contexts, some of which I've talked about, but many of others I haven't had time to. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Time for questions.
Okay. So thank you for showing the power of a simplified model. But my question is that your analysis is on the basis of a supervised learning with the target signal given at the top layer. So the question is whether that's the right framework for brain's learning. So if you think about more like unsupervised learning, so how much of your result carries for such a case?
Yeah, it's a great question. So again, I view supervised learning as another simplification. It's clearly not exactly what's going on in the brain. It's probably something more like reinforcement learning. And I think it will be possible to extend these results to reinforcement learning. It's something I'm currently working on, but you have to get the right framework to get it all to work out. But I think it will be possible.
So what about unsupervised learning? Like in a linear case, it will be something like a PCA.
Yeah. So this is why I just sort of briefly mentioned, hey, there's this caveat generalization error. I didn't look at it. So to me, the unsupervised learning, it's definitely in the brain. I actually have some other work comparing unsupervised learning models to representations that you see in the brain. And I think that's probably sculpting how you generalize. And in that way, it's very important. But in the brain, there's this critical period epoch when an animal's young where it does really seem to be statistics driven, but kind of in adulthood it really does need to be associated with attention or reward. So I would say it's more in a way supervised there.
So these feed-forward networks don't capture the fact that in the brain all of the feed-forward connections have feedback connections, and I wonder if you've thought about how that would change the picture.
Yeah, let me see if okay. Right, so depth versus hierarchy. We often say the brain is hierarchical. Is depth a different concept? And I contend it is. So a hierarchy, you're basically saying that lower levels connect only to levels above them, all right? And what you don't allow is loops back. By depth, what I mean is serial sequential stages. So I'm completely fine with allowing feedback connections backwards, going all the way back down, provided there are no level skipping connections from the input to the output. I think that's the key thing. It's about serial chain-like structure. And you can also have recurrent connections. All of those things, again, I started with feed-forward networks just because that was the easiest place to start, and I'm presently working on these extensions. So I think it is important. And another thing to just throw out there is, although I haven't explicitly included feedback connections, maybe I have implicitly done that because it's learning by gradient descent. So somehow it has some kind of backpropagating signal.
Why don't you like level skipping?
I don't like it or dislike it. I just think that in the brain, as an empirical matter, it looks like you don't have too much level skipping. So in the Fellman-Van Essen diagram, you do have level skipping, but the average number of levels you skip is only about 1.8. So it seems like there still is really this serial structure. Yeah.
So I'm sorry, we have time for one more question, and maybe we can have then
pick me
in the panel. Okay.
Okay, so you start off with random orthogonal weights. Why don't we keep them orthogonal? Why don't you make the W?
Great question. Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because I like this. I have to find it though. Okay, this theory I think explains why you need all these adjectives on the pre-training scheme. Why is it layer-wise? Why is it unsupervised? Why is it pre-training? And this will get to your point. So why is it layer-wise? Well, if you pre-train multiple layers, you're back to the deep learning problem. So that doesn't work. Why is it unsupervised? You can actually analyze supervised pre-training. It doesn't give you a balanced initialization. But now to get to your question, why pre-training? Well, the formula that I came up with depends on the initial scaling. So the fundamental quantity there is the initial scaling. So if you regularize towards your suggestion, force things to be orthogonal, you're preventing the learning process from deorthogonalizing when it needs to. And so it will help you if the task requires orthogonal matrices. I mean, it's a prior you could add, but it won't help you in general. And the point is, just having the initial scaling is all you need to do. The learning will be fast after that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.